Thank you for joining us for our next edition of our 49er Industry Chat. I am going to pause as we welcome our audience into the webinar today. Thank you for joining us today for our next edition of the 49er Industry Chat. My name is Noemi Guevara. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement at California State University, Long Beach. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. If you have any questions throughout the chat today, please submit them using the Q&A box located above or below your screen, and we will ask those questions for you. This session is being recorded and it will live on our website at csuob.edu/alumni. And now it's my honor to introduce our guest speaker with his presentation, Passion Meets Purpose, Careers in Social and Environmental Justice. Charles Mason Jr. is the Environmental and Social Justice Manager for PG&E, where he leads company-wide internal and external efforts on ESG issues, policies, regulations, training, and operations. Charles previously served on the Business and Community Outreach Team of the California Public Utilities Commission as a local government and community liaison, collaborating with local governments and community-based and statewide organizations. He has dedicated his life and career to addressing racial equity, social justice, environmental justice, transportation justice, and related issues. Charles was the founder of Ubuntu Green, an environmental justice nonprofit in Sacramento region, and founded the Sacramento Environmental Justice Working Group. His work expertise has also included stops at AARP, NAACP, the Thurgood Marshall Scholarship Fund, and the U.S. Congress. Charles is also a trainer and coach on institutional and structural racism, implicit bias, utilizing these tools to transform organizations and communities. Charles received his BA in political science from CSUOB and a master's in public policy and administration from Sac State, also attending George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management and Howard University. Please join me in welcoming today's 49er Industry Chat host, Charles Mason Jr. Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm glad I can join you and share hopefully some good things with our alumni and current students.
Wonderful. We're really excited to chat with you and get hear a little bit about your journey and your current role today and all the various things you're doing today. But let's start at the beginning. You know, what was your experience like at the beach? Did you enjoy your time? Why political science? And if there was any specific faculty that mentored you and guided you and kind of steered your path towards this career you have now.
That's a loaded question. So my journey through college was it started off conventional and went unconventional. So initially, I out of high school, I went to Howard University, and then I started this journey where I would jump coasts every year or two, and ended up initially did my first transfer into Long Beach, which was good. I did very well. Then I left, went back to DC for many years, and then came back a couple more times. And finally, after I was about 10 years into my career, I said, I got to go back and finish this degree, and went back to school. One of the professors I had worked with previously in the political science department, Jerry Raposa, I remember going to him during my second stint, and he was tough on me, right? About it. So you're doing great work out there in the world. I think I was already working in Congress by that time, but he kind of pushed. And then when I came back, he was one of those that served as kind of a mentor and supporter of work. And also coincidentally, he was on the what is it, the community development board for the city. So having my dad was on the board, and so I had to triangulate it. I was also lucky enough to, I took a lot of classes inside the Black Studies department. So Dr. Karanga became a mentor as well, and had dragged me out a few times to work on its campaigns after understanding my background at that time. So I had a lot of that. Being there at like 3 different times in my life was interesting. When I first was there, I was like 19 or 20 years old, and then I was like in my early 30s when I came back and finished. And so they were different journeys, but I had my fun and joy. I did everything from living in group houses, to living with family, to living in my own place, and but I was able to engage in a lot of social activities at the school, and then following some of the sports teams, and really enjoyed it. And the political science department was cool. I enjoyed being there. Made it to the honor society by the end of it. If you knew how I started my college career, you were like, how did he do that? But to graduate with honors, but it was rewarding, and you couldn't beat the location. Even though I grew up in Southern California, it was not too far away from Long Beach, in Rancho Palos Verdes. It was a different environment, but I really enjoyed it, and I had other mentors. I think one of the things that also ties back to this, they had this class during my second stint that they called Clear Vision, and it was a class that was co-led by 3 instructors, and it was all tied to trying to address diversity issues on campus. And the class, we were the first class to do this, and it was a series of different speakers and instructors that came in and talked about different perspectives, whether it was race or ethnicity or gender, and so forth. And it was a really powerful class, but it was a really good cross-catch of students. And at a certain point, we had a professor, I think he was an economics professor, that did the talk on African American communities. And then at the end of the class, the teachers came to me. He says, we would like to learn more about kind of the perspective you have. And so I got to teach one of the classes, which was really fun. It helped ignite me. So that was one of the great experiences I had, and when I was at Long Beach. And I did work. I worked in the center behind you in your picture. I worked as a tutor. I worked as a business, one of the people that set up all the events and activities in the student center in my last stint. So, I went from that full-time job that paid well to tutoring and setting up events, but it was good for me.
Wonderful. And I think that's great to hear that, like, not everyone has the same journey that you started, left, worked, and then came back, and then left and came back again, but you stuck through it and you finished at the end. But also you found like a community that helped you lift you up and continue that journey, which I think we all need to find and be reminded of, that you need to find that.
Yeah, and there's like the early journey is like people my age for the most part. A few of my high school friends were there, and so that's who was there. And then the next phase, it was a little older, but you still had people that were close. And then the final, I found like I created all these friendships, and I was like mentoring all these people. And some of those folks are still friends to this day. They're like, well, you've already worked on Capitol Hill. So they wanted my perspective. So I kind of just fell really neatly into the older student mentor role, which made it more rewarding than I thought it would be. I thought it was just going to be, I got to get through this last year, right? And it actually turned out to be something much better.
Wonderful. So I know you mentioned you were already working at the U.S. Congress. Like, how did you find that job? What was that like? Because you were maybe younger, and then like, how did you find your passion, like your title says, to pursue the environmental and social justice kind of path?
Yeah, getting to Congress started years ago when I was in school in the DC area, and I just researched all the members of Congress that I would want to work for, did my resume, walked through the halls and handed out resumes, and I ended up getting an internship with the former congressman, the late Congressman John Conyers from Detroit. Now, and my mom's from Detroit, but the congressman didn't know I had that connection when his staff hired me. And then I told my mom after. She goes, "Well, you know, your grandmother helped get him elected, right?" I'm like, in the 60s. I'm like, what? And so it's like me and I said, yeah. So I called my grandmother. She goes, yeah, he'll know me by my nickname. So I walked into the congressman's office and told him, and he says, "Where is she?" I'm sending her a gift, right? He just remembered her instantly there. So like part of the legacy of community service was already, bred into me that I didn't even know in that case. But that was how I got there. And then a few years later, I took some years off from working in kind of the political world. And then when I was back, I ended up doing the same thing. I started walking around the Capitol Hill with my resume, handing my resume out to folks, and got an internship with Senator Barbara Boxer, and then ended up getting hired full-time a month later, and then went on to work for Congressman Pete Wisconsin from Gary, Indiana, as an aide. So that's how I got in, but some of it was leveraging contacts, but a lot of it was just the old school way you would do it. Even folks do it now. You just go and you just walk the floors of Congress and hand out resumes that's there. I would say, like people always talk like, where did you start kind of like the environmental justice journey? Like my dad was raised in Watts, and so that's where we lived when I was young. And then we moved to other areas later. But that, growing up in that community, he was young, during the time of the Watts riots, would tell stories about how, he was out being a young activist. And so that was part of my upbringing as well. And then, I would always see the dichotomy from once we left Watts in South Central LA and we moved to Rancho Palos Verdes, the dichotomy of those communities and the environments they lived in inspired me. And then at a certain point, I started working with a lobbying firm in DC that mainly represented municipal governments. A lot of them in California, were clients like City of Inglewood and Huntington Beach and Sacramento and Stockton and so forth. Santa Ana were the clients, and one of the portfolios I had was around some of the environmental work, and in that there was these places they call brownfields, and so these are like properties that are either lightly contaminated or suspected to be contaminated, right? So you've heard of Superfund sites, those are the really badly contaminated ones. These are ones that are often lead to blight happening in many communities, but for the most part happening in low-income communities and communities of color. So you may drive down the street and you may see a vacant lot and you wonder, like, why don't they ever develop that lot? Why is there junk all over that lot? Well, you never know. It might have been an old gas station or cleaners or just the suspicions of it. So I ended up helping cities throughout the country get grants and a revolving loan fund from US EPA from my position and most of those projects were targeted towards communities of color that had not seen that. So I started seeing that economic development. And then at that point, I became very attunely aware of the tie back to environmental justice. And if you understand, the environmental justice movement really started taking off in earnest in the 80s, and then by the 90s was blowing up as the US EPA and other agencies began to get involved. So I ended up, began to get locked into that, and I found that wherever I went, right, I was always the person. If our policy agenda didn't include environmental justice or social justice, then I would make sure I would weave that into it, whether I was doing transportation work or housing work or energy work. That's how the seeds were kind of planted in me, partly from the activism and political involvement that my parents and my grandparents had, but then also the exposure I got doing my work in DC.
Wonderful. And I think this kind of ties, I have a question in the chat that kind of ties into what you just touched on. You know, of late, more and more large organizations are building environmental and social justice into their missions. Your work predates this trend. Why is this work important to you, and why is it smart business?
Yeah, you have seen that, right? And I was just having this dialogue earlier with some folks from energy companies from around the state, the country, and the push. It's obviously, you can go back 2 years and with George Floyd and all the other things that were happening at that time, that started creating this explosion of companies and agencies, first addressing the diversity, equity, and inclusion offices if they had one, if they didn't have one, right? And then from a land use perspective, you began to see a burst of companies trying to deploy staff around environmental justice and social justice, right? So, which is critical. And so what the chat probably is alluding to as well is that I spent years working in companies and agencies and associations, pushing. Like, you not only did you need to add this to how we did work, but also how where it stands in the company, right? So it's like, the higher up those positions are, the better, right? Because it's harder when you're lower in the pecking order to get it implemented within the country. But it's critical. One of the things, there's a group called Policy Link that does a lot of equity related work based out of Oakland. They're a national think tank and policy group, but what's really thing that they have talked about in the past, the reality is that when you do work around equity and justice, and you include everybody in your business decisions, your economic decisions, it actually improves the economic viability and benefits for everyone, right? So a lot of the mentality has been historically that if we continue to cut up the pie more, right, that somehow it shrinks the opportunities for others. But the reality is what happens when you lift up those that are most disadvantaged or come from these communities, it actually expands the pie and actually improves everyone that's there. So I make that economic case a lot. It's like it's good business, right? And so in our industry and other land use related industries, right, you may have sites that have been contaminated, and then and you're dealing with the liability of that contaminated site. But what happens when you go in and clean up that site, and then you work with whether it's the local government or the local community to clean up and remediate that site and build something great for the community on it? There's a benefit not only for the bottom line of the company, but for the entire community. And so that's why, I think that's really, really important that we've continued to do this everywhere, right? We can no longer ignore that, that it's so important that environmental, social justice, and diversity and equity and inclusion are included in the practice of all organizations.
Definitely, and making sure that you keep that community, oriented lens always on as well. Question in the chat, like how does your law background fuel the advocacy and policy work you do?
Yeah, so the good thing is I didn't end up going to law school. I got close. That's why I went and got the master's in public policy. I got really close, but I have worked around laws my entire career, because when I'm working in Congress, you're working around laws. When I was a lobbyist or doing government relations work, you're working on writing the law. I'll answer it this way: is that so the benefit of the career I've had is that I've been able to work on federal, national policy and regulations. I've been able to work on state policy and regulations, and I've been able to work on local, regional policy and legislation, and have run, a few grassroots organizations, right? So that unique perspective, because I understand how the laws and regulations work at every level. It gives me a unique perspective when I go and do my work wherever I've worked over the many years, and I'm able to understand how all of these things interconnect and how different laws and regulations impact each other. So it's been very powerful, because often you're sitting in the room and you're dealing with someone who's only done local work, or only done energy sector work, or only done statewide work, and they may not understand that interconnection. So having started off my career in a kind of the more federal policy and regulations has really helped. And one of the things I always tell young people when I meet with them, I've been telling these folks even when I was the young person, was, if at all possible, take the opportunity to go see how the government works or does not work, right? Depending on the perspective of where you're at. I always tell people, go to DC so you can see the source. Go spend a summer on an internship. Go spend a semester on an internship. Take advantage of the programs that Long Beach State has, and take advantage of that. And if you can't do DC, go up to Sacramento and do that. And if you can't do that, do it in your local board of supervisors or mayor, or city council office. It's just really critical that we understand how our government works, but also the connections that you're going to make, the people you're going to get to know that are going to be really great, not only for your career, but also your friendships, right? And I guess, I took my son to see colleges in DC and New York last August. And it was like, okay, now it's time to use those connections. And he was hanging out. He was like, did not realizing that, but there's a power. So it's not just for you, it's also for your kids and your family members, and you leverage it. So, I say do it. It's worth it, even though you'll be hungry for a little bit, but you'll be all right.
Yeah, I mean, we always talk about to the students or our recent alumni to make sure they network, because you never know who you might meet, who might be that opening door in the future, or that reference in the future. So definitely network, like you're just saying. I do have more questions in the chat. Transportation justice is in your bio. Can you talk a little bit more about what this is and where you see this issue?
Yeah, so if we go way back, right? So when did, and so not only transportation justice can sit by itself, but it also is interwoven, right? So if you go back at minimum to the 1940s, 1950s, when many decisions were being made about where highways went, you just go look outside from where you are right now, look at the communities that the freeways and highways are going through, for the most part, since in LA. But you can see that happened all over the country, right? And so we began to build infrastructure, particularly transportation infrastructure, that was all based on freeways, highways, right? A lot of like you've heard the stories about the old rail system that we had in LA, that was the whole region was completely connected, right? Well, the automobile industry came in and said, we're going to be freeways, and we want you guys to stop making these this rail system run, and so we spent the last 30 years trying to rebuild a rail system that we already had in place. What that ended up doing is, as people moved to the suburbs, and pretty much, you've heard of white flight, it was there. It's like, I remember when my dad says, well, when we first got to Watts, places like Compton and Watts and Gardena had much larger white population. And when the Black community started moving in, people took off. Well, with that went the infrastructure dollars to build out the suburbs. So what you started seeing is that there was a loss of busing and trains and other transportation systems. If you did have buses and trains, they didn't properly serve the community based on time of day and so forth. So with the transportation justice movement, and they do more than this, it's been around, a lot of it's been around up until recently, really about how to improve bus service, how to connect communities to rail, right? How to control costs for riders to ride those systems, right? How to make sure the transportation in their community is not polluting their community in those ways. What's happening now, as we begin to see California trying to move to carbon neutrality, right? One of the things is like ensuring that in doing that, that we continue to create a robust public transportation system that serves all modes of transportation, but also dealing with the fact that we're going to be moving to electric, more hybrid and electric vehicles. Well, people in lower income communities cannot afford to pay the price for a hybrid vehicle or for any vehicle. Average cost of a vehicle now in this country is $50,000, right? And so one of the things that a lot of folks, including my company, are working on is how do we provide resources to help folks finance or purchase electric vehicles, and how do you build out the electric vehicle infrastructure in all communities, right? Including locations that are at public housing and affordable housing and other locations. And then how do you integrate affordable ride share and other programs into those communities?
That's what I've been wondering. Like, you think about Long Beach, there's so many apartments. Like, if you get an electric vehicle, like, where do you plug it? Because you don't have your own home unless you want to go to those stations. But who has, not everyone has that kind of time. So is that even worth it,
Yeah, well, you hear a lot of talk about building electrification. That's part of this carbon neutrality. So part of that is trying to work with owners of apartment buildings and affordable housing complex to dedicate spaces, and then we come in and build the charging infrastructure, so it's right there. It's already there, right? So you don't have to worry about it. And I've been trying to tell folks this for 10, 12 years. I'm like, you're not driving to the next city, you got to build it here. So there's a lot of prioritization of dealing with having the infrastructure there in the communities, but also having the affordability of electric cars. And it's going to be 10 years till electric car prices drop enough until it's adopted, at a certain level for the cost really to start dropping. But at least more automakers are entering in the hybrid market and developing their electric cars.
Right, definitely. As a trainer and coach, what are some of the biggest challenges and areas of resistance you've seen when working with organizations and employees? How can an employer combat this so there is less bias in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a good question. The first thing I always folks is when I'm doing the trainings is you got to have your leadership bought in. All right, it's you can train the whole middle section of a company, right? If the leadership's not bought in, you're going to have a hard time. And so having conversations around race and implicit and unconscious bias are really tough conversations for a lot of entities to have. So you really, what I always do is like, well, who's the leadership here? I want to make sure I talk to the leadership people ahead of time so that we can make sure we're on the same page, and so forth. It's also in the design of what you're bringing to the table, right? There are some trainings out there are like in your face, right? Designed to make people feel uncomfortable, right? Because if I remember earlier in my career, different parts of my career, you go through new employee orientation, they'd have a section on diversity training, right? How many places did I go to when there was like diversity training where it was optional, or certain people would just not leave the room or not being in the room there, or they would never participate in subsequent diversity trainings, right? So you have to kind of change the tone of how you do it. So I try to create as interactive and sharing and safe, collaborative environment so that we not only are folks learning from me, they're also learning from each other, right? And hearing each different perspectives. And so, once I'm in the space and we've got the buy-in from leadership and we're doing the training, sometimes you deal with, sometimes some people just aren't going to move. You gotta live with that, right? But I find most of the time, once I've done a series of trainings with a group, there's always movement. And then when I do my post conversations with the leads for it, they always talk about the change in the conversation at work and how people are really trying to work through it and where they might have had doubts. There. The other thing that's really tough is this: we're in such a supercharged, racialized environment in this country, is that you have to cut through that early on, right? And so I try to design my engagements in a way to cut through that, because you'll still see things pop up in the chat while you're talking, and you're like, okay, let me deal with this, and you try to do that. You just got to, and you also got to be really good at like keeping anyone, particularly someone who doesn't want to be there and doesn't want to have the discussion happen, from derailing the discussion. That's the beauty of virtual training. You could just mute them, but it's there. But I try to, my goal is I listen to everyone, and if I identify people who are really being challenged, I will find a way, either during breaks or between trainings, if it's a multi-day training, to try to see if I can engage with them and talk with them through some of their issues.
And we have to feel uncomfortable to be able to have these real conversations, at the end of the day, because that's what they're meant to be. Yeah.
It's years of diplomacy, but you're trying to move the needle, right? Not push people into corners, and there's a time for that type of environment. But when you're trying to get people to really deeply look at themselves, it's really important for that. And I always start with the interpersonal in the training. So it's about talk about you and look at your realities, and you can share that, you cannot, and that is really important. And I often will share, where I have fallen short, right? Or where I felt I had fallen short, and how I've worked through those journeys, so that it personalizes that I'm not here as this perfect trainer. I'm real like you, and I always emphasize that I'm learning from you as much as you're learning from each day.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So PG&E is regulated and an investor-owned electric utility. How does the impact the policy and activism you lead? Is your work directed by the state of California, or is it more driven by the stakeholders?
That's a good question. Well, we know we're regulated. So by the Public Utilities Commission, the California Public Utilities Commission, who I used to work for, regulates a lot of our activities, right? Because we're natural monopolies as investor-owned utilities, and you guys that have down there Southern California Gas and Southern California Edison falls into that, and so does San Diego Gas and Electric, and so that is a very significant force on us, right? And so here's one of the good things that comes out of that. It's not all bad, or it's highly regulatory structure. It is. 4 years ago, the CPUC passed a environmental and social justice action plan, which they just updated in April, right? And I had some influence over the second version, because I came in as the first version was being adopted. And what's great about that, it has these 9 action areas. Most of them apply not only just to the PUC, but also applies to the IOUs, so us and the others that I named. And it really gives a blueprint of how we should be doing environmental social justice work, including stakeholder engagement, right? What I have done since I've been at PG&E, I've actually developed our own action plan and framework around environmental social justice. We've had a policy for 20 years, but we're updating that. But I have begun to develop that, including looking at how we are engaging stakeholders. So since I've been that stakeholder on the outside pushing on so forth, I try to make sure their voice and their interest is at the forefront, and balance it in what we're developing. Like even with what we're working on now internally, I will be vetting with stakeholders in the next month just to get their opinion and input that's there. The only thing that makes any of that difficult a lot of times is resources, right? So I really push, like, you got to pay your stakeholders, you got to pay your community-based organizations you're working with to do that. And so working through whatever regulatory restrictions that are out there. But I found surprisingly that the opinions of our customers, opinions of our other stakeholders, do hold a lot of weight, and we have really honest and real discussions when we hit that kind of rubber where either the regulations don't allow us to do it, or it's a tough business decision, but it's not there. And part of what I'm working on right now is that we'll be able to infuse environmental and social justice into all of our business decisions, right? Which would include the input from some of our stakeholder groups that we have that advise us on a regular basis.
It's wonderful that you're keeping, all the stakeholders involved and they all have a voice in the process. You dedicated a good portion of your career to advocating for justice and equity. Have you seen progress? What are we doing well as a society, and what do we need to do better?
What are we doing well? Well, I think it's kind of like how we started, right? It's like finally corporate America, universities, associations, right? Governments are sincerely embracing the need to address, diversity, equity, and inclusion and related issues. So that's significant because for most of my career, it's kind of been lip service, or you've got to find the right place to push it through, and you got to keep fighting, and you end up having to serve on committees that are reviewing and drafting up things that never go anywhere. So you're like kind of the pushing that. So it's great to be in an environment that, like, in this last few years, I've worked with 2 different organizations, each of them opening themselves up to what can we continue to do better, and what kind of structures can we put in place. With that said, I think I alluded to this before, is the resourcing of functions, whether it's like a function I have or functions of a diversity and inclusion office, is ensuring that, as you develop these offices and these entities, that they're reporting as close as they can to the CEO, right? I don't like being more than 2 or 3 steps away from an executive, one of a high executive, which is really important because it begins to give it the clout to get the work done that they want to really see done, right? And then fully staffing these spaces. One of the things I developed before leaving the PUC was the framework for them to develop. They didn't have a diversity, equity, and inclusion office, right? Which they've been working on and developed a framework of that. But really, one of the things is being really aggressive about the financial resources and the staffing resources that were needed in order to be successful in that space, right? And so I think that is critical. And I also think there needs to continue to be local, state, and federal political leadership around those issues, right? And then I know that becomes challenging, but when we have things where we can't even agree on how to address voting rights at the national level, it has a significant trickle-down effect on a lot of these related issues. So we still have tons of work to do. We're nowhere near the finish line, but I'm glad to see the progress. But I just hope the next wave of progress is just not fueled by Black people being killed.
Right, I agree. What do you hope for the future of Long Beach as a community in terms of transportation and environmental justice? Does CSULB play a part?
Yeah, they should play a part, right? If you're not the largest, you're the 2nd or 3rd largest employer in the city, right? If I am correct, right?
Yeah, I can believe you are the 2nd largest employer.
There's one of the port. Does the port beach out or something? The
Long Beach Unified.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, my sister went to Poly, so I.
Okay.
One I'll address is that Long Beach, with its influence, with its academic resources, with its ability to provide research, the ability to provide brain power from the students, right, who are riding the buses and taking the trains and driving in and through the community, has a really incredible role that they can be playing, if they're not already playing at some levels, around transportation and environmental justice within the city, and being a good partner for the city. I think with Long Beach, one of the first places it always starts is continuing to find ways to address the emissions that come from both the Port of LA and Port of Long Beach, right? Those are huge issues, and how you minimize the impact that's happening on the communities that live close to there, which with our traditional, if you go look at the maps, you'll see, oh, there's a big environmental justice communities right next to the port and all the way up through the corridor, which tend to be communities of color and lower income communities in the city. So there's a lot of work to continue to do to address those issues within Long Beach and begin to have greater increasing collaboration with local organizations that are working with those communities, and increasing stakeholder engagement at the city level and at the county level and with the port to have a greater focus on addressing EJ and Long Beach, because there's a lot going on there. There's been a lot of positive movements that have happened in Long Beach in addressing, but there's a long way for the city to go. And I think the university can continue to play an increasingly important role in helping address it. And I always believe in, use student power, whether undergrad or graduate students, and now PhD students, right? One of the things I did when I did environmental justice, when I run organizations, but I always go to the universities, and up here would be Sac State and UC Davis. But I'd always go and find students who were passionate, interested in learning, who could do research, who can go out in the community, who represented the communities, and, would be great assets. So, we use our students. They're our power, they're our future, and they know the path to get the work done.
Yeah, they're the ones that can make the change for the future too. What does a typical day in your ESJ look like today?
It changes. I did a lot of stuff like a typical day. So let's say today, we start off and I'm developing, editing things like regulatory filings, or I'm editing, updating my ESJ framework, or I might be doing a training where I do monthly trainings on environmental social justice inside the company. So I'm slowly making my way through folks so I can spread that. So I do that. A lot of working with folks in different departments, just setting up meetings and talking about ESJ and how it impacts their work, and beginning to build not only the collaboration, but also the co-ownership that this is vital in the company. Some days are lots of meetings, some days are not. Some days are just thinking, just thinking space, right? A lot of my job, obviously, gets lots of relationship building, lots of building relationships and building trust. To do that, it kind of goes back to the question about, the increase in focus on diversity and inclusion and EJ related issues in companies. A lot of that is building trust and getting to know people, and even if you have to do it virtually or by phone, which is what I primarily do right now, then you do it in this there. So as you begin to talk to people, they begin to see themselves or their work in it. So it changes day to day, but it's fun. It's engaging. Sometimes I do go in the field, to we have these things called manufactured gas plant sites. So back in the day, we would, in the 1800s to the 1920s, 30s, 40s, we made gas through a horrible process that was really dirty. And then when we went to natural gas, it got cleaner. So there's these manufactured gas plants all over the country that have to be remediated. So I went to one of our sites up in Vallejo, and I go out to the sites and see what's going to happen on this site, hear about all the things the community wants on the site, what the city's going to do with the site and there. So I go out and do some of that, and also do some meetings with stakeholders as well.
Wonderful. So I know I had asked you before we jumped online, but can you share more about your nonprofit? Is it Ubuntu Green? How did you integrate the networks you build professionally with those you build through your nonprofit?
Yeah, so that just started. I was sitting one day. I was in DC. I was going back and forth between DC and Sacramento for one of my jobs, and I was sitting around and I started hearing about all these resources that were going to go into green jobs and the green economy. This was at the beginning of Obama's administration, and then I said, what about the justice side of it? So I started designing the nonprofit to work on community engagement, to work on policy, and other issues, and launched it here in Sacramento. It was the first grassroots organization focused on environmental justice in this region. And so that's, I got into that, and what I did is the way I structured and built it was, particularly from a policy advocacy standpoint, I made sure that we had a layer of federal, state, and local and regional policies that we would focus on. Now, we only had the bandwidth to focus a lot on local regional, but we joined coalitions at the state and federal level where we had continued to have input on that. And then I just took everything that I had learned about how to best engage communities and brought that to this table. And then I went out and listened and talked to people from a variety of different communities. I went to the Latinx community, I went to the Hmong community, African American community. I went to the different interests, whether it would be around transportation or other land use issues or housing, and just listened a lot, particularly the first 9 months of the organization's founding, until I really started jumping into initiatives to understand what the issues were. And it's funny enough to go back to earlier in my career, one of the biggest issues was around basically brownfields and vacant spaces. There were all these littered properties throughout their communities that were eyesores. They were either, unhoused people on them, or they were junk, stuff just dumped on it, undeveloped within the community without any structure or plan to deal with it. And that became like a focus of a lot of our work. It's like, how do we then allow for community gardens to be built on vacant properties in the city and county? And so we work to get regulations changed at that level so that can happen. So just examples of how you can begin to transform the community. But I brought in the concepts of community engagement, the skill building part about training people to help build their capacity through an institute that we developed, and advocacy and policy, and used all those pieces together to move the agenda.
Wonderful. So I know we're up against time, but I think I have to squeeze in one more question. The way your career has evolved, is there a class certification experience you wish you would have taken advantage of when you were a student? And even now, I mean, you span policy, environmental, like how do you even keep abreast of everything?
Yeah, because I was in political science, and like I said, I took a lot of Black Studies class. I thought it maybe, because when I first started off at college, I was a business student. I wish I would, done a little bit more with some business skills that helped me, because, once you start running things, departments, organizations, those things come into play, even if you have somebody else who can focus on it. But I wish I'd done that, and I wish I would just have stayed put when I first got to college and just got it done with, right? Instead of wandering and chasing what happens, you get a job, and you get another job, and get another job. I'm doing everything I want, but that was there. But a little bit more focus. And I wish at Long Beach in particular, I wish I would have gotten a little bit more involved with maybe student government or something like that.
Wonderful. So before we go, any words of wisdom, anything you want to, final thoughts you would like to leave for our students and our alumni?
Words of wisdom. People come to me a lot. They're like, what should I do? What should I go after? Right.
Right. Well, you need to find your journey, but
you find your journey. Well, I always talk to people, do what you love, right?
Right.
And there's multiple different concepts, right? Do what you love, and hopefully you can find something that has a purpose that will help transform society, right? Transform your communities. And you can do that from multiple different spaces, right? You can be a business executive and do that, but you can build a social enterprise as you're doing it, and really build into your business model that, that sock company, right? Every time you buy a pair of socks, I have them. I'm about to put a pair of them on for a bike.
They donate them.
They have Bombos or something. They donate a pair of socks to an unhoused person for each one. So you can do it even in that space, but I tell folks, do what you love, find your passion, and go there now. It doesn't mean it can't change mid-career. Trust me, it's changed several times for me. But if you start from there, right? Because what ends up, a lot of us, as we all can kind of relate with this, your parents send you off to school and you're going to become a doctor, or you're going to become a lawyer, or you're going to become an accountant or a dentist. If that's not your passion, right, go with where your passion is, or go get a minor if you're still in school,
Right.
in your passion as a way for you to feed that. And I always start there, and I always, you know, I'm a big proponent of people embracing their strengths, right? And so, like, if you work for me or you're on my team, I'll always get you the book Strength Finders, which goes in and helps focus on your strengths, right? That you focus on your strengths, not your weaknesses, right? Doesn't mean you don't have to develop basic skills, like how to run this Zoom or the computer, or, you know, Outlook or something. That's a given. But focus on the things that you're strong in, and do assessments out there that help you, like Strength Finders and other, that really help you know where your strengths are and really guide you. Because a lot of times you don't know. I did it with my son. They have a youth one, and it was so spot on. This is like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. It was so spot on with who he was and what everybody else saw. And he didn't see it. When he was able to see it, it really helped him change his perspective. But I watch it be very transformational for folks to see what their strengths are, and then to focus on their strengths growing. And I'll say that in the closing part is, like, I'm in this leadership development thing for the millionth time at work, a different leader one. And like they echoed the same thing, right? It was not Strength Finder, it was a different thing. It's like, don't waste your time trying to develop things that you're not strong at, right? Really focus on stuff. So I would say focus on your strengths and do what you love, and you can find a way to have a successful career doing what you love. You just have to keep pushing and keep your eyes open a little bit further, and you'll see that it's there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Charles, for a great conversation today, for sharing a little bit about your journey, your experience. Before we go, if any of our students would like to connect with you, are you okay that they reach out to you via LinkedIn?
Yes. Do you know how to find me on LinkedIn?
Yeah, they just put Charles L. Mason, right? And maybe add a note that they saw you on the 49er chat, or that they're a student at Cal State Long Beach, so they could, you could get them approved.
Yes. Yeah, come in, and I'm glad to share and have dialogue with anyone that wants to have it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you giving of your time and sharing your journey with us today. For everyone, thank you for joining us. Please visit our website or follow us on social media to learn about our future chats. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.